In 1978, a 9-year-old girl named Kim was walking to the corner store to get some pasta sauce for her mother. On her walk home, a man she had never met before walks up behind her and speeds up to where he's walking in step with her. And he looks at her and introduces himself and says, "Hi, I'm Dr. Ramsey. I'm a pediatrician. Do you know what a pediatrician is?" And Kim immediately had a bad vibe about this Dr. Ramsey character. There was just something odd about him. The fact that he had approached her so suddenly and was right on top of her. So her reaction was to not answer his questions and instead put her head down and walk even faster because she knows she's almost at her house. She's almost at safety. And if she can just get there, she doesn't have to deal with this strange man. But as she sped up, so too did Dr. Ramsey, staying in step with her, and he begins peppering her with additional questions and comments. "Are your parents looking for a pediatrician for you?" "Of course they are. You're a big girl now. How old are you? What's your name? Your hair is so beautiful. Where do you live?" When Kim got to be about 10 meters away from her house, she just takes off running, and she bolts up her back steps through the kitchen door into her house, slams the door behind her, and for a few seconds, she just stands there, almost anticipating hearing this Dr. Ramsey guy come up the back steps behind her. But he doesn't, and after a couple of minutes, she pokes her head around and looks out the window, and he's not there anymore. And she feels completely relieved that that weird guy is now gone, and she can just forget about it. But it turns out she couldn't just forget about this, because Dr. Ramsey was not going away anytime soon. It wasn't long after this first initial interaction with Dr. Ramsey that Kim was home one day, and she happened to be looking out her front window to the road, and she sees a blue Ford Galaxy drive slowly by their property. And she's looking at the car, and she can tell immediately that the person driving it is Dr. Ramsey. But Dr. Ramsey doesn't see her. She's kind of obscured behind curtains on the window, and she's watching him, and he was looking at their front door, and he was waving as if there was someone standing on their front steps, but Kim knew there wasn't. And so he bizarrely just drove the rest of the way past their property, waving the whole time, and then drove off. Now at this point, Kim has not told her mom or her dad or her siblings about Dr. Ramsey, because that first interaction, she kind of chalked it up to maybe her being paranoid and maybe even being a little bit rude that she ran away from this doctor who was just trying to talk to her. But now that she's seen him drive past her house and he's acting strange, her alarm bells are starting to go off. But she doesn't tell her parents quite yet. But the next day when Kim was playing outside, a car drove by and she turned to look at it, and it was the blue Ford Galaxy, and who was driving? Dr. Ramsey. And he slows down and he waves to her and he smiles at her as he passes by, and she kind of looks at him like, "What are you doing?" At this point, Kim knows he's acting inappropriately. Whatever his angle is, it just didn't feel right. So she runs inside and she explains to her mom that when she went to the store to get that pasta sauce on her way back, this strange man, Dr. Ramsey, approached her. She came back to the house. Now I've seen him twice outside of our property and he's clearly waving at me. There's something wrong with this guy. Kim's mother reacted to this news the way most of us would, which is, you're talking about a doctor in this nice neighborhood who's driving down the road saying hi to my kid, and he claims he's a pediatrician. Like, that's a child's doctor. It makes sense he might be waving to kids. That's part of his job, talking and interacting with kids. And so her mother says this can't be a big deal. I'm sure he just works in the area and this is part of his commute going down this road, and now you've seen him a couple days in a row. It's just a coincidence. But shortly after this, when Dr. Ramsey started calling their house, Kim's mother and father very quickly ditched the "he's a doctor so we can trust him" routine and became very concerned. A couple of days after Kim had told her mother about Dr. Ramsey, Kim gets called into the living room where her father's sitting, and he looks very troubled. And he calls her over and has her sit down, and he says, "You're not in trouble. I just need you to talk me through exactly what happened when Dr. Ramsey approached you. Your mother told me about it, and there's been a couple weird things that have happened here, and I just got to hear the story from you." And so Kim goes through the story. She describes how she was leaving the store. He just kind of showed up, and Kim did not talk to him. She put her head down and basically ran back to the house, and that was it. Kim's father reacts to this like he's totally perplexed about something, that he's hearing the facts, but they don't make any sense. And he says to Kim, "Are you sure you didn't say anything to him?" And Kim said, "No, I was scared. I didn't say anything." And Kim's father's like, "Then how did he know your name?" Kim was like, "What do you mean?" And her father said, "Well, just the other day, I got a phone call from someone saying they were Dr. Ramsey, and they asked to speak with you, Kim, by name. They said, 'Can I speak to Kim?' And I thought that was odd because, you're my child." And I said, "Well, why do you need to speak to my daughter? Why can't you speak to me? I'm her father. You're a doctor. You can speak to me." And they hung up. And then they called back again, and they asked for you by name again, as if they hadn't heard me the first time. And so I said again, "Why do you need to talk to my daughter? You can just talk to me. I'm her parent." at which time they hung up again. And so I wanted to hear from you directly if you had given your name to him, because the fact that he knew your name on that call seems really odd to me. Kim assured her father that she did not give him her name. And you got to remember that this is back in 1978, so Dr. Ramsey would not have been able to use the internet to try to find Kim's name, nor would Kim's name have been listed in a telephone book because she was a minor. It would have been her father or her mother that was listed in the telephone book. So in order for Dr. Ramsey to have her name, he would need to know someone that would give up her name or do some digging, which is obviously very creepy considering the fact that Kim has never met him before. He's a strange older man and she's a 9-year-old girl. So with that in mind, Kim and her parents are on edge about this Dr. Ramsey character, but they don't have any clear recourse because he didn't do anything that was criminal. They couldn't go to the police and say he figured out our daughter's name, because they would be saying a doctor, a pediatrician no less, knows our child's name and was waving and smiling at her. But shortly after this, Dr. Ramsey's behavior would take a dark turn. He would call Kim's house again just a couple of days after those first 2 calls, and Kim's father would answer, and right away, Dr. Ramsey says, "I need to talk to Kim." And Kim's father goes into protective mode and he says, "Do not call this house again," and he hangs up. But seconds later, the phone is ringing again, and at this point, the family has come in the room because they heard their father screaming at someone on the phone. The phone's ringing, and their father picks the phone up and puts it back in the receiver, canceling the call. And he looks at his family and he says, "Do not answer the phone." The phone rings again. He picks it up and cancels it again. On and on, the phone rang incessantly all night until they disconnected the phone line. The next day, when they plugged the phones back in, Kim's parents told all of the kids, "Do not answer the phone. No matter what, don't answer the phone." And once again, the phone starts ringing, and Kim's father picks it up. He doesn't say anything, and he hears on the other end of the line, Dr. Ramsey asking for Kim. And he says, "Do not call this house again," and he slams it, thinking that's going to do it, but of course it doesn't. And over the next several days, anytime the phone was plugged in, it was practically a non-stop call from Dr. Ramsey. And one time when Kim's father did pick up the phone, he reacted to it like it was some horrible thing being told to him, and he put it down, he disconnected the phone, and he went into the kitchen. And one of Kim's brothers overhears their father talking to their mother in a hushed tone, and he's saying to her, "He just told me he's going to hurt Kim unless he can speak to her." After this threat was made, things got very complicated. Back in the 1970s, there weren't any stalking laws that would protect Kim and her family from Dr. Ramsey. Even though Dr. Ramsey had just threatened Kim, there was no proof he had done that, and he hadn't done anything physical, and so there wasn't any legal recourse. The police couldn't really do anything. And so Kim's father ends up calling one of his friends who happens to be a police officer. He explains the situation and he says, "Would you mind for the next little bit just escorting my daughter Kim to and from school, because we don't want her to be out walking around by herself with this guy rolling around the neighborhood." The friend says yes, and he began bringing Kim to and from school, and Kim felt a lot safer with her father's friend because you have this police officer that's walking around with you, but it also isolated Kim in a really major way. She wasn't really allowed to go outside anymore without an escort, which meant her life was confined largely to being inside almost 24/7, and there was no clear resolution in sight for how to handle Dr. Ramsey. And so it was like this indefinite period of time that Kim was just not going to be allowed to have a normal life. Once Dr. Ramsey was completely cut off from any interaction with Kim, I mean, she barely went outside, and when she did, she was with this police escort, and she never answered the phone. Once that was going on, Dr. Ramsey became desperate. One evening, Kim, her sister, 2 of her brothers, and her mother were in the kitchen chatting when one of her brothers suddenly reacts like he sees something out the back window that leads out to their garage. And he runs over and he's looking out, and Kim and her family are turning to him saying, "What do you see? What's going on?" And he goes, "There's someone in the garage." And they all run to the windows and they're looking out, and there's a window on the side of their garage. Their garage was detached from their house, and there's a window on the side, and there was this man there standing there looking out at them. And once he saw that everybody is looking at him, he ducked his head down. And as Kim's family is looking at each other like, did we really just see someone in the window? Because it's kind of dark and they're not there anymore. Suddenly the garage door slowly rises up, and out pops a man who stands up, looks at them just long enough that Kim yells, "That's Dr. Ramsey. I saw him. That's Dr. Ramsey." And then the guy takes off down the driveway away from their house. And Kim's 2 brothers immediately run out the house and chase him down the road. But eventually he darts into another property and he disappears, and they can't find him. Kim's mother calls the police. They show up. They take down some statements. And they basically say, look, if he comes back, let us know. But for now, just go back in your house and lock the doors and keep an eye out. For 2 weeks after the garage incident, they didn't hear from Dr. Ramsey and they didn't see Dr. Ramsey. And it was this great reprieve from this very stressful time in their lives. But after those 2 weeks, Kim's father walked outside onto their front porch and he saw their beloved German Shepherd was dead lying off the side of the porch. And he goes over to the dog and it looks like it's been roughed up, but it's hard to tell what actually happened to it. Now, at first, the family is absolutely devastated about the loss of their beloved animal. But shortly after that, they start thinking, do you think Dr. Ramsey could have had something to do with the death of our dog? And so Kim's father calls the police and says, I think our stalker, Dr. Ramsey, killed our dog. But the police would say there was no evidence to suggest anybody killed your dog. It could have just been an accident. Also, we haven't even been able to identify who this Dr. Ramsey person is because there are no Dr. Ramseys in this town. And so probably he's using a fake name. So the family's sad and frustrated, but once again has nothing they can do about this. That night, Kim and her family are sitting at home. They're all very sad about the loss of their dog, and the phone rings. Now, prior to this, there had been 2 weeks where Dr. Ramsey hadn't called once. And so Kim's father picks the phone up and says, hello? And it's Dr. Ramsey. But unlike all the other calls where Dr. Ramsey almost always began with, put Kim on the phone, this time he started with, there are 7 people in your house right now. Your wife's in the kitchen, you're in the living room, your 3 sons are watching TV in the den, and your 2 daughters are upstairs in their respective bedrooms. Kim's father is obviously horrified to hear this because it was all accurate, and he just screams into the phone, stay away from my family, and he hangs up. After this phone call, Kim's father was naturally very shaken up by this because even though they knew Dr. Ramsey was probably living in the area and he clearly drove past the property and was local, it just felt way more intimate for him to be naming things that meant he had to have been near their house recently and looking in windows. And so Kim's father runs around the house and makes sure all windows are shut and locked, blinds drawn, all the doors are locked, and then he goes all around the house to make sure all his kids and his wife and everybody's okay. And then afterwards, he considered calling the police, but felt like it was kind of futile because to this point, they haven't been able to help them and nothing has changed. It was just another creepy phone call. And so they don't do anything. The next day, they plugged their phone line back in because they need to use a phone, and shortly thereafter, the daily calls with Dr. Ramsey began again. And now, every call, whenever they did pick up, started with Dr. Ramsey identifying who was in the house and where they were. After a couple of days of this, the family was just living in paranoia. It was this horrible time in their lives, and one night, the phone rings, and Kim's father picks it up, ready to just scream at this guy and take out his frustrations, and Dr. Ramsey, instead of giving the report, starts by saying, I can open your kitchen window and I can open your French doors to the side of your house. Kim's father is about to yell at him, but instead just hangs the phone up and runs into the kitchen and he checks the window and he knows it's faulty. And clearly, so does Dr. Ramsey. And so he gets a piece of twine and he ties it over the latch and gets it as tight as he can. And then he ran over to the French doors, which were faulty. You'd have to push pretty hard, but you could, in theory, pop the doors open if you knew these were faulty doors. And so Kim's father is not taking any chances, and he gets some nails out of the junk drawer and he nails a row of nails into the ground, right into the hardwood, sitting immediately outside the frame of the door. So if you were to push on them, you would just butt up against the heads of these nails and it would keep it shut. It was his temporary solution until he ordered a proper lock to fit on the door. At this point, it was safe to say Kim and her family were living in fear that Dr. Ramsey at any given point could just break into their house, because clearly he was canvassing their house and testing different entry points, and he had already found 2. And so now they just felt totally unsafe in their house. But oddly enough, after that last call where Dr. Ramsey had said he knew the kitchen and the doors were faulty, the calls from Dr. Ramsey decreased to almost 0, and they didn't see him anywhere, and it started to feel like maybe he had gotten his thrills and he was moving on now. And it just so happened that around the time the family is starting to think this could be over, the mother and father had to go to this company function where the kids couldn't go. So the kids would be alone, but the kids said, we're fine with it. We have each other. The house will be locked. We won't go anywhere. And the parents, even though they hated the idea of their kids being alone at all, because of everything going on with Dr. Ramsey, they felt like, you know what, it does seem like he's kind of moved on and we're only going to be gone for a couple of hours, so I'm sure this is going to be fine. So that night, after her parents leave, Kim is sitting on the couch, she's watching TV, her younger brother is laying on the ground right in front of her, and her sister is sitting on the other end of the couch and she's on the phone. And Kim said she found herself looking out of her room into the kitchen towards the side of the house where those French doors were that led out into the side yard, and those doors were still only secured by the nails her father had put into the ground. The lock her father had ordered had not come in yet. Kim found herself looking at these doors, feeling really uneasy about it, and then as she was looking at it, she could have sworn she saw the doors begin to push open, and she's looking at it even more closely, and then for sure she sees the doors bow inward like someone is pushing on the top and the nails are stopping the bottom, and for a split second she sees the clear silhouette of Dr. Ramsey, and she screams. It wakes up her sister and her brother, and she's pointing at the double doors. They all look, and once again he pushes on those doors, exposing himself just for a second to the kids. So now all three kids have now seen this guy trying to force his way into their house, and so they scream and run right upstairs. They go into Kim's room, they shut the door, lock it, turn the lights off, and they go over to the window that's looking out to the front of their house. Now Dr. Ramsey is on the side of the house, so they wouldn't be able to see him through this window, but they're just praying that he does not break through those doors and come in the house. They're hoping they'll see him as he exits the front of their house, and they're kind of keeping an eye out the window, just praying they see this guy leave their property and leave them alone, but they don't see him leave, and they don't hear any noise downstairs or outside. It's just total silence. And they're wondering, did he already get in the house? They decide they need to look for themselves. And so they leave Kim's room and they sneak down the hall to the side room, which was their brother's room, that overlooked the area where Dr. Ramsey would be. They go over to the window and they poke their heads up and look out the window downstairs. And sure enough, there's a man standing right in front of those French doors with his hands on them, kind of looking in, looking around. And at this point, the kids suck themselves down underneath the window so that he doesn't see them. And as they're crouched down, they hear him start banging on the door downstairs, at which point Kim's sister, who was there with her, just says, "What do you want?" The banging stops and the man says, "I have a pizza. Come down and get it." Kim and her siblings didn't order a pizza, so they just yell out, "If you don't leave, we're going to call the cops." And then Kim pokes her head over the window and she looks down and she can clearly see it's Dr. Ramsey, who's now turned and he's running away from their house. Just a couple of minutes later, Kim's two older brothers return. They were out at a skating rink and they come back, they come inside, and Kim and her two younger siblings go up and tell them what happened. And immediately those two run out and start looking for him, but he's long gone by now. So they come back in, they shut all the doors, they lock everything, they shut the blinds, and they say, okay, all we can do is just get a knife out of the kitchen, each of us, and just be armed until our parents come back. And so they all grab a knife, except for the youngest brother, and they all retreated to their rooms and basically just waited for their parents to come home. An hour later, Kim's parents are still gone and all the kids are still in their rooms, and her younger brother gets hungry and he decides to go down to the kitchen to get a bowl of cereal. So he goes downstairs and he's getting his cereal together and he starts feeling like someone is watching him. And he's looking around and he knows all the curtains have been drawn and everything's locked and shut, and he's just psyching himself out. But he notices the French doors that are leading to the side of the house. Those have glass panes on them and there's nothing covering them. And so as he's getting his cereal together, he finds himself constantly looking over at this door, and finally he decides, okay, I'm going to put my cereal down and just go look out the glass to just make sure no one's there. And so he walks a little bit closer to these doors and he gets about, 5-6 feet away, and the glare from the lights above still make it impossible to look out this glass. And so he's kind of squinting his eyes, but he can't see anything. And so he steps forward and he puts his hands like this and he looks right out one of the panes of glass, and staring back at him is Dr. Ramsey, who's probably been there the whole time. And he's just standing there looking at him, and he freaks out. He screams for his brothers, and as soon as he turns back around, Dr. Ramsey has run away. He's gone. All of the siblings come pouring downstairs, knives in hand, and they're asking what's going on. And the youngest brother is trying to explain that he just saw Dr. Ramsey right on the other side of this door. And the older brothers go running outside. They're screaming for this guy. They're looking for him, but he's gone. And they all come back in the house and they don't know what to do. And so they all stay up together in the kitchen with their knives, with everything shut and locked, just waiting for their parents to come back. And shortly after, they hear their parents using their keys to come in the house. They come in, and and the kids explain what happened to their parents, and the parents feel horrible. And they're like, I'm so sorry that we left. We should never have left you guys. But as horrible as this was for the family, when they call the police, they can't really do anything because he wasn't there now. Nobody got hurt. Nothing was taken. And they don't even know what this guy's name is. And so they just said, stay inside, keep everything locked, and let us know if he comes back. A couple of horrible weeks for this family goes by where they're living in constant fear. The parents are never away from their kids. The father had to take time off from work. It's just this very stressful time where they are totally prisoners in their own home. And after about 2 weeks of this, Kim is at school. She's at recess with her class outside, and she was playing on the playground when she looks out at the road and she sees Dr. Ramsey in his car parked, waving at her and yelling her name. And so Kim is horrified. She turns and runs to her teacher and she points at him and she says, that guy's stalking our family. I have to go inside and tell my parents. They immediately took this very seriously. They took Kim inside to the principal's office and they called home to Kim's mom. And when she picks up, Kim's mom explains that she just got a call from the school office asking her to verify whether her husband was going to be picking up Kim from school early. And Kim's mom said, no, he's not picking her up. There's no one picking her up early. And that's when they put it together that Dr. Ramsey must have been in touch with the school to try to convince them that he was Kim's father and he was here to pick her up. And that's why he was parked outside. Kim's mother is horrified because she's thinking to herself, if the school hadn't been diligent to confirm this, there's a chance they would have given her child to Dr. Ramsey. This proved to be kind of like the final straw. Even though there was a whole bunch of final straws along the way, this was the one that ultimately pushed Kim's father over the edge. That night, Kim was sleeping in bed when she woke up because she was thirsty, and she goes downstairs to the kitchen, and she's surprised to find her father is sitting at the kitchen table, the lights are off, and he's got a gun in front of him, and he looks totally disheveled and upset, and she knows right away that this is because of Dr. Ramsey. She's not thinking this is anything else, and so she walks over to the sink and just kind of ignores the fact that this is happening. She gets a sip of water, and then she sits down with her father and says, is everything okay? And her father looks up and he just says, no, I'm not okay. I'm tired of leaving the house and wondering if when I come home, my family's not going to be there anymore. I'm tired of not being able to protect my own kids. I'm tired of this. This has to end. Kim didn't know what to say, so she just sat there in silence with her father until he told her to go back to bed. Kim says after this night, they never heard from Dr. Ramsey again. It was like he vanished off the face of the earth. No more phone calls, no more drive-bys, no more anything. He was just gone. And while we don't know for sure what happened to Dr. Ramsey, I think it's safe to assume that Kim's father had something to do. In 1989, 22-year-old Eloise Lindsay was a fresh college graduate, and she was at a crossroads in her life because even though she just earned her degree, she really didn't know what she wanted to do with her life. And because she was an experienced backpacker, she thought a good way to kind of get her life together would be to go on a sort of retreat, go out into the woods, go out into nature, and kind of find herself. So she had planned this very detailed 43.3 mile hike along the Appalachian Trail, starting in South Carolina, where the first 7 days of the hike she would be totally on her own, and then at the 7-day mark she would meet up with a friend at a particular rendezvous point. Her friend would give her resupplies and would be her companion for the rest of the hike. When Eloise told her parents what her plans were, they were not concerned for her safety because she was an experienced backpacker. She had made trips like this before. And so they said, great, we'll see you when you get back. So on November 4th, Eloise sets out to begin her journey down the Appalachian Trail. And the first couple of days of her hike were great. The weather was beautiful, the scenery was amazing, and she had all this time to just kind of be by herself and look internal and think hard about what she wanted to do with her life. But on the third day, when she woke up, she was sleeping inside of a tent she had camped just off the trail. She woke up and she had this intense sense of dread. She couldn't really place where it was coming from, but she knew something was wrong, and she's kind of doing inventory of her life, like, what did I forget? Is there something that I'm just not thinking about right now? But she kind of pushes it aside mentally and thinks, okay, you know what? I'm just going to pack up my campsite here and get hiking, and I'm bound to, come up with what it is that's making me feel this way. So she gets out of her tent and she begins packing up her campsite, and she's looking out, kind of scanning the tree line, not because she was looking for anything, but just because she happened to be looking out. And she could have sworn that she saw a man standing, 30, 40 feet away behind a tree. And she kind of did a double take and was staring at him. It's, it's broad daylight, it's the morning, and they're near a trail. So it isn't like unbelievable that there might be someone near her at that very moment. But she kind of did a double take and she looked at them again, and this person was gone. And she stood there for a minute, just kind of looking in the direction of where she had seen this guy, wondering, Is my mind playing tricks on me? Did I really see someone there? Why aren't they showing themselves again? If there was someone there, they clearly must have just been looking at me. Why aren't they, poking their heads out again to communicate with me in some way? We're out in the middle of nowhere. We should be talking to each other. But the guy never shows himself again. And so as she's standing there wondering what she should do, she isn't ready to yell out to this person because there's part of her that's a little bit nervous about yelling out to some stranger in the middle of the woods. But she starts to get this really intense feeling that she's being watched. And it feels an awful lot like the sense of dread she had while she was in the tent. And she's starting to wonder, are my instincts or is my sixth sense picking up that I'm being watched? Like there's some predator out there looking at me right now? And even though she has no way of knowing if that's actually true, she's alone in the middle of the woods. And even though she's experienced, she can't help but feel really vulnerable. And because this guy is just not showing himself again, she feels a little bit threatened. And so she begins to panic and she starts packing up all of her stuff as quickly as she can. And as soon as she can, she takes off down the trail away from that guy she saw in the woods. As she was walking down this trail, she couldn't help but think someone was right behind her. And she kept turning around to see if this person or whoever it was behind her, and no one was ever there. But this visceral feeling that she was being watched, that sense of dread she had, it just was not going away. And so she started walking faster and faster. Before long, she was running, and she's realizing that she's in a section of the Appalachian Trail that's very remote. She's not near civilization. She's not near her next rendezvous point. And so she's thinking to herself, I need to get off this trail. I need to get to a road. I need to get away from here as soon as I possibly can. And so her options were to continue on this trail for several miles, and it would probably take her until well into the night before she was going to reach civilization. Or she could take a shortcut because she believed there was a road that was running parallel to her trail, but it was way down the mountain. It would require leaving the trail and basically cutting through the wilderness to get down to this road. But she was pretty confident it was right down there. And because this threat of this person or thing following her was so intense for her, she decided to leave the trail. She couldn't stand the idea of having to spend another night out in the middle of the woods with this person stalking her. And so she walks off the trail and starts running down the mountain. It wasn't long before she started to hear audible sounds coming from what she believed to be this person that was following her. And she would turn around and there'd be no one there. And then she started to walk, trying to listen as she's walking, and she would hear footsteps far away from her, and she'd turn and there'd be nobody there, but she was certain someone was following her, someone was stalking her. And the sounds that were coming out of this person, this animal, whatever it was, they sounded like, a deep male voice, but you couldn't recognize if it was a language of some kind. It just sounded more like a grunt or a yell of some kind. And so her heart rate's elevated, she's panicking, and she's walking as fast as she can just through the middle of the wilderness, hoping she's walking towards this road. But after walking and running for miles into the middle of nowhere, she has not come to a road. It's now completely dark out, and she knows she's lost. And so she has to set up camp in the middle of nowhere, and she knows somewhere out in the middle of the woods is some person or something that is stalking me. And she's all alone. She has no way to contact anyone. She doesn't have a cell phone. It's 1989. And so she sets up her campsite and she gets in her tent, she zips it up, and she lays there hoping she doesn't hear any sounds. And sure enough, within minutes of being inside of that tent, she starts hearing those audible sounds coming from somewhere in the forest. And she hears what sounds like heavy footsteps walking around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she hears this. But luckily, they don't come up right to her tent. So there's some separation between her and whatever is making these sounds. And then finally, the sun comes up. She is out of that tent, packs it up, and continues running in the direction she hopes is the road. And of course, all day long, she has that sense that someone is watching her. She's hearing footsteps coming from behind her. She would turn. She doesn't see anything. She would hear that audible grunting sound, or that low voice coming from somewhere behind her. But again, she would never see whoever it was or whatever it was that was making the sound. And then again, the sun is starting to set, and she has not found the road. She hasn't found a trail. And she's thinking to herself, I can't even backtrack, because if I turn around and start walking backwards, I'm bound to run into this very thing I'm trying to escape. And so once again, she sets up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She gets inside, and as soon as she's laying in her tent, she starts hearing those heavy footsteps somewhere out in the woods, kind of walking around the perimeter of her campsite. She's hearing that low, audible sound that she can't quite place. And at some point she falls asleep. She gets up the next morning. She jumps out of her tent, packs it up, and starts running, hopefully in the direction that will bring her to civilization. A couple days later, when Eloise was supposed to meet her friend on the trail at the 7-day mark and they were going to finish the hike together, well, Eloise doesn't show up. But after several hours, when Eloise did not show up, her friend left the trail and contacted authorities and filed a missing person report. And the police would launch this massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she had said she would be. And for the next 14 days, hundreds of police and volunteers and helicopters are scouring this area, and there's no sign of Eloise. And so after 14 days from the time her friend filed the missing person report, the police had to turn the search off, and they say, look, we can't find her. 2 days after the search was terminated, so 23 days after Eloise had initially set off for her trek through the Appalachian Trail, a hunter that was out in the middle of nowhere near the Appalachian Trail discovers Eloise perched up against a tree. She's totally emaciated, she's dehydrated, she's delirious, but she's alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter because she believed the hunter was this person that had been following her. But when she realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was brought back and brought to a hospital, and she was checked out. And besides being dehydrated and, emaciated, she was okay. And she would detail in multiple interviews and in her official statement that she had been chased for the past almost 3 weeks in the middle of the woods, and she doesn't know who it was or why they were chasing her. And then interestingly, she said right before she was found, so a couple of days before this hunter finds her, this person, this thing, whatever it was that was following her, got so close to her a couple different times that she was so scared she ditched her backpack that contained all of her life-saving equipment, like her sleeping bag and her tent, and it had some food and water in there. She ditched that so she could be lighter, so she could run faster away from this thing that is chasing her in the woods. So you gotta figure, you gotta be at such a high level of fear that you're prepared to ditch the one thing you really require to survive out in the wilderness, which was her pack full of supplies. And then after she's ditched her pack and she's run for some distance, she's got no supplies, no food, no water, she stumbles across this tree in the middle of nowhere that wedged inside the trunk is a cache of donuts and pound cake. And so she takes the donuts and pound cake, and between that and the stream water she had found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before she was found. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement were baffled by it as well. Some people think Eloise had a mental break, and she effectively made this whole situation up, that she really was lost in the woods, but no one was chasing her, and she was just kind of paranoid and running around the wilderness for a couple of weeks. Other people, including park rangers that work that stretch of the Appalachian Trail, believe it's possible she could have been stalked by wild men, which are basically people that live out in the mountains that are effectively feral, that live off the land, and they've been known, according to local legend, they've been known to attack park rangers, and people that live out in that area have claimed to have seen these wild men, and they kind of match the description of what she was describing. But as of right now, there's no official explanation for what happened to her other than she got... In December of 1961, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold. There might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful and our stuff's getting wet and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. and they didn't have a GPS. They were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road, and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard, and it was starting to get dark outside, and so the pair decided, you know what? We got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark, and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night, and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground. They'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they're just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. And at some point they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are. And now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second, and James Sr. pulls out his map and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around. He's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going. When his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything, he said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight. And it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this, because it was a pretty miserable night the night before. And so it makes sense he might be tired. But they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on. They do have food. They do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated, and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before, when they were up in the tree, even then, it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here, and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of the situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders. And for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with his son, and he puts his son down by a tree, and he sits down next to him, and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we got to get ready for another night. We got to get back up in a tree, and we got to do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree for the night because, he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see, and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here. I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline, and he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops. And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest, and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes, there's no road over here. I'm in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is, how? Because he couldn't walk until now. And my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree. He picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by presumably his son. And so he's walking along these footprints and he's yelling out for his son. He's not hearing anything. And this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? We're obviously in this together. Like, what's going on with my son? And so he's walking, and after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. This is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction, and holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain, and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge, and he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon that, the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially the thought was, well, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away. 2014, a young woman named Jen was sitting in her sister's living room looking out their back window where her son and her 2 nephews were playing. And as she's watching them, one of her nephews named Harrison walked over to this tree and began peeling the bark off of the tree. And for Jen, this brought back a very strange childhood memory that she hadn't thought about in decades. And without meaning to actually say the words out loud, Jen kind of blurted out what was going through her head, which was, so weird. And her mother, who was in the other room, heard her say that, and she yells into the room, hey Jen, is everything okay? What's so weird? And Jen, feeling a little bit embarrassed that she just said that out loud and that her mom heard her, is quick to try to dismiss it by saying, oh no, sorry, it's nothing, I didn't mean to say that. But as she's trying to dismiss it, her mom had walked into the living room where Jen was and saw Jen was looking out the back window towards the boys. And so her mom walked right up next to Jen and goes, what are the boys doing out there that's so weird? Are they doing something they shouldn't be doing? And Jen's like, no, it has nothing to do with the kids. I just saw Harrison, who was doing something that reminded me of some weird thing that happened to me, and I blurted out my reaction to it. That's all. And Jen's mom looks at her and says, well, now you got to tell me the memory because I'm totally intrigued. Jen says, okay, Mom, I'll tell you the story. I don't know if Frankie's mom ever told you this or not, but when I was 8 years old, I spoke to Frankie and he was doing some homework and he told me to come meet him outside of his house and that when he was done, we could meet up and go play together. And so I walked over to his house, and I was standing across the street in front of that small group of trees that we called the pine cone forest, even though it was just a handful of trees, but we all called it that. Anyways, I was standing over there, and I was just kind of mindlessly peeling the bark off of the tree. I don't even remember consciously deciding to do it. And so as I'm peeling the bark off the tree, watching Frankie's house, waiting for him to come outside, I noticed to my right, there's this guy walking through the forest towards me. And then I look at him, and I've never seen him before. And before he got even within 10 feet of me, I could smell cigarettes. He reeked of cigarettes. And his teeth were very yellow. He's missing a number of teeth. And I noticed right away when I looked at his hands, I don't know why I was looking at his hands, but I looked at his hands, and he had these pointy yellow fingernails that almost looked like he was intentionally growing them out to be long and jagged. And he comes walking up to me and stops completely in my personal space. And instead of looking at me, he looks at the spot on the tree where I had been peeling the bark off. And he's literally like 1 foot away from me, so close that I had to lean back because I didn't want to be rude and run away. So I'm leaning back to avoid being right next to this guy. And all I can smell is cigarette smoke. And he turns from the tree to me and he goes, "What do you think you're doing?" And I'm like this, and I'm like, "I'm waiting for my friend." And he says, "No, what are you doing to the tree?" And I remember looking at him and then the tree and saying, "Peeling the bark off?" And that's when he raised his hand up and pinched my arm with his nails, not with the pads of his fingers, but he was using his nails, and he's pinching down on my skin, and through gritted teeth, he says, "How would you like it if someone peeled your skin off?" I remember as he's pinching me, I was so terrified that I didn't do anything. I was like in a trance and just stood there looking at him, wondering what's about to happen. And then as luck would have it, Frankie's mom just happened to come outside and yelled, "Hey, come on inside, Frankie's done with his homework." And so that kind of broke me out of my trance. I pulled my arm away and I began running away from him across the street towards Frankie's house. And I turned around once, kind of expecting him to be chasing me, but he wasn't. He was still standing next to the tree that I had pulled the bark off of, except now he was watching me. And I ran up onto the porch and ran inside, and that was that. I remember wanting to tell you about it when I got home, but for some reason I didn't. And then days turned into weeks, turned into months, and before long it was just a distant memory, and I never really thought about it, and at some point did forget about it, until just now when I saw Harrison peeling the bark off of the tree, and it brought it back, and that's why you heard me say, "So weird." That was my reaction to it, because I'm wondering, who was that guy and what happened to him? Like, that's so creepy. After Jen told her mother this story, she was expecting her mom to be a little bit horrified by it, because it is a pretty startling story about her own child. But Jen's thinking it's been so long since this happened and nothing came of it that her mom would probably quickly move on from it. But Jen noticed her mom looked very concerned, and she turned to her and she goes, "Mom, this happened like 2 decades ago. Like, this is not a big deal." And her mom looks down for a second and then looks up, and she has this look of guilt on her face. And she says to her daughter, "Jen, I should have told you this when it happened, but it's just, you were so young, and I felt like it was going to ruin your childhood. And so I just didn't tell you, and it seemed like you forgot about it, but obviously you didn't. And so I guess you got to hear the full story now." Jen's confused at this point, and she says, "What are you talking about?" And her mother, who now looked really uncomfortable, she's touching her face and she looks very anxious. She says to Jen, "It's time you learned who that man really was." Before Jen could ask any more questions, her mom just says, "Honey, just sit down and I will explain everything to you." So they sit down, and Jen's mom is still acting pretty uncomfortable. This is obviously a difficult subject for her. And she starts by saying, "Okay, so do you remember how in our neighborhood where you grew up, everybody seemed to know each other? It was a really tight community of people." And Jen's like, "Yeah, I remember that." And her mom was like, "Well, because of that, it made it really easy to spot people that were, outsiders that didn't live in the neighborhood. And so if a car came down the street and I didn't recognize it, I would find myself looking out the window and watching the car to see where it was going, because there's no reason to be in this neighborhood unless you're a visitor or you live here." And so I was in the habit of people watching anybody that showed up that I didn't recognize. And I know a bunch of the other mothers in the neighborhood did the same thing, one of them being Frankie's mom. Anyways, on the same day that creep came up to you and pinched your arm when you were 8 years old in 1995, well, that morning, Frankie's mom, Sonia, she happened to look out her front window and she saw a vehicle she didn't recognize. And it was a work van, a white work van. It didn't have windows in the back, and it was parked across the street near the pine cone forest. And so she assumed it must be a work truck, and whoever had brought it here was, working on one of the houses in the neighborhood. But where it was parked, it was not close to any one particular house. And there was lots of places you could have parked on the street. So it seemed odd if you're going to be doing work on a house that you wouldn't just park in front of the house. Like, why would you park, inconveniently farther away in front of this random forest? And so that got her thinking that something's up with this van. But she didn't think it was bad. She just was trying to make sense of it. And so all morning she found herself going to the window and looking out to see if someone was going to claim this van, but she never saw anybody go near it. She didn't see workers going in and out of it. She didn't see any activity that was related to the van. It was just this empty van parked randomly across the street. And by the afternoon, when still no one had claimed this vehicle, she was getting ready to call the police. So that same day, you and Frankie had spoken on the phone and planned to meet up at the Pinecone Forest after he was done with his homework. And he didn't tell his mom about these plans. And so she didn't know that you would be very close to this van. Had she have known that, she would have told you to not wait out there, but instead to come right inside and don't go near this van. So at some point in the afternoon, when Sonia's getting ready to call the police, and you were actually already over at the Pinecone Forest waiting for Frankie, Sonia's looking out the window and she sees the back two doors fly open, and that guy who pinched you jumps out of the back and starts running into the Pinecone Forest. And from where Sonia's looking, she can only see part of the forest. The other portion of it is to the right, that's out of her view through this window. And so she turns and runs in her house to the side window of her house, and she looks out at that section of the Pinecone Forest where this guy has run to, and she sees you standing in front of the tree, and she sees this guy sprint right up to you and sees him pinch you in the arm, and he's talking to you. And that's when she ran out onto the porch and yelled for you to come inside. And she would tell me later that when she did that, she tried to sound very natural. She was worried if she sounded like this was an emergency, not only would it frighten you, but it might trigger this stranger to grab you or take you, because now he's been made. Someone realizes he's a bad guy and he might take you. And so the whole time she's watching you, she was watching him to see if he was going to chase you. And so when you came inside, she did her best to be totally calm and told you to go play with Frankie. And as soon as you were out of the room, she ran around the house and locked all the doors, all the windows, and then called me. And we decided it made sense to call the police. Even though you were safely in the house, we didn't know who this guy was, and it seemed like he was intentionally targeting you, like he was waiting for you the whole time. And so Sonia calls the police, and a police cruiser was sent over to our neighborhood, and they quickly found the white van that matched the description. They pull up next to it, and they walk to the driver's side, and sitting inside the car is a man that matches the description of what Sonia gave. And he's acting really weird. He looked like he was on drugs, or maybe he was drunk, or something was wrong with him. Something was off about him. And so the officers had him step out of the car, and they search his car. And in the front two seats, there was nothing but cigarette butts and trash. And there was a partition wall between the front two seats and the back workspace of the van. They went around to the back of the van, and they see this guy has screwed a latch onto the back of the two doors, right across the middle, and there's a padlock through it. So there's an additional lock on this back door. Clearly, he doesn't want anybody getting in the back of this thing. And so the police turn to this guy, and they're like, "We need to get in the back of your truck. Can you please open this?" And at first, he was, making excuses why he couldn't open it, but finally he relented and pulled out a special keychain he was carrying that had two distinct keys on it. And he used one of them to undo the padlock. He opened that up, and then he swung open the doors, and he backed up. And the police look inside, and they can't believe what they're looking at. Inside of this van, all over every surface in the back, were pictures of you taped to the walls, to the ground, to the back. Everywhere you looked, there was a picture of you. And they weren't just recent pictures of you. There was at least a couple pictures of you when you were 6 years old, and you were 8 when he approached you. So we know he was following you for at least 2 years. Also in the back of the van were binoculars, as well as a camera that presumably he was using to take these pictures of you. But that's not even the worst part. After this guy got arrested, one of the officers pulled out that keychain that had the key to the padlock on the back of his van, and he noticed the other key on the keychain was not just a duplicate key to the same padlock. It was a different, unique key. And so the police go over to this guy, and they show him the key, and they say, "What is this to?" And he says, "It's to my storage locker." And so the police track down his storage locker, and they go over there, and they unlock the lock with the key, and they open the door, and what's inside is straight out of a nightmare. The entire storage locker, the ceiling, the floor, the walls, all of it was covered in clear plastic wrap. And behind the plastic wrap, you could see on the walls were hundreds more pictures of you. And in the middle of the storage locker was a dentist chair that had been anchored to the ground. Next to the dentist chair was this silver tray like you would see in a dentist office, except on it were all these knives. And they were not surgical or medical knives. They were like meat cleavers and hunting knives, crude instruments. And then next to that on a table was an anatomy book where he had used printouts of you to bookmark different parts of the book that he was taking notes on and highlighting, all of which had to do with the female anatomy. In the back of the locker was a rotted mattress that was just sitting on the ground, and anchored in the back on the wall were chains with handcuffs extending off of them, and then next to the bed were dozens of empty 5-gallon drums. When the police showed us pictures of the inside of his van, we were very shaken up. It was just so awful to imagine someone taking advantage of you in that way, watching you. But when they showed us pictures of the chamber that he had created inside of his storage locker, that's just something I'll never get over. He clearly had plans for you. After hearing this story from her mother, Jen is a mixture of angry with her mom for not telling her sooner, but also sad, that her mom had to go through that with her child because now Jen is a mother, and she can only imagine how horrible that must have been for her then and even still now. And so all Jen could think to do was give her mom a hug. After they embraced, Jen asked her mom, what happened to this guy? Where is he? Did he go to jail? And her mom told her that he had confessed to stalking Jen, and he confessed that everything they found in the storage locker in his van was his, and that he understood the implications, but he never gave his real motives for it or really what his intentions were. He was ultimately put into a high security mental institution for the criminally insane, and her mom said she has no idea if he's still alive or if he's been transferred, but that was the last she knew about him. And so Jen wound up doing some homework and figured out where he was being held, and she asked to have a meeting with him because she wanted to ask him to his face, what were you planning to do to me? I want to know why you did this. And he agreed to take this meeting, but the day before they were supposed to have it, he took his own life. And so Jen doesn't know if that was brought on by their impending meeting. It certainly seems likely, but unfortunately, that's it. She doesn't get any more answers, and it will end with a big question mark of... From 2002 to 2006, Cullen Finnerty was perhaps the most successful college quarterback in history, winning 3 national championships and being named the Division II Player of the Decade. He was also perhaps the toughest college quarterback in history. Most quarterbacks will spend their careers looking to avoid getting smashed by defenders. Not Cullen. Cullen was 6'2", 240 pounds, and he would tell his teammates that he wanted to get hit, and he would hit back. And his coaches hated it about him, but his teammates loved this about him. Cullen was also famous for playing through injuries. His junior year in college, he broke his collarbone, and he didn't tell anyone, and he played through an entire playoff series that he won. After college, Cullen's professional football career was not nearly as successful as his amateur one. He played briefly for 2 NFL football teams, the Baltimore Ravens and the Denver Broncos, but when he wasn't getting any playing time and he just could see the writing on the wall that this was not going to be a match, he was not going to make it in the NFL, he left for Europe to play in a European football league. But when his European football career started to sputter out as well around 2009, he came back to the United States where he joined a very small-time indoor arena football league. And while Cullen's love of football was still there as much as it ever was, he knew at this point, playing at this low of a level, that his career was effectively over. Around the same time that Cullen was hanging up his football cleats, he would meet Jennifer, who would become his wife. She was an all-state volleyball player and in many ways was just as competitive and as athletic as Cullen was. They were kind of like a perfect match for each other. They married in 2010, and Cullen, this big man, big-time quarterback, was shaking and crying at the altar because he was so nervous and excited about marrying Jennifer. Because I think this was a really big turning point for him, where he was basically putting football in the past and starting this new life and building a family with Jennifer, and he was really excited about it. The newlywed couple moved into a house together in Michigan where they had 2 kids, and Cullen landed a good job in medical sales, and by all accounts, Cullen was just hitting his stride post-football. On Memorial Day weekend in 2013, Jennifer's family was planning this 3-day fishing trip along the Baldwin River in Michigan, and the Finnertys decided they would join them. And so Cullen and his wife and kids, they rented a cabin that was going to be near the the campsite that Jennifer's family was staying at. And for the entire weekend, it was just this great fishing trip where everybody had a great time and the weather was beautiful. And on May 26th, so the last night of this 3-day fishing trip, Cullen, who had recently purchased this pontoon boat that they had used for this fishing trip, he wanted to just go out one more time on his boat, this boat that he was really proud of, and fish for another 30-45 minutes before ending the weekend. So Cullen put on his waders and his jacket, he grabbed his fishing pole, and he had his family drive him to the stairs that led down to the water where his pontoon boat was. Before he walked down the steps, he turned and told his family that he'd be out for about 30 to 45 minutes and that he wanted to be picked up at the next boat ramp down the way and that he would call when he needed a ride. 42 minutes later at 9:27 p.m., Jennifer receives a phone call from her husband, and she's expecting it to be the call where he says, "Okay, I'm ready to get picked up." But when she answers the phone, Cullen is frantic, and he's telling her that he's being followed by 2 men in the tree line, that he's out on the water on his pontoon, but there are 2 men in the tree line that he can't see, but he can hear them, and they've been following him for some time. And before Jennifer can even get a word out, Cullen says to her that he's going to beach the boat and take his clothes off, and then he hangs up. Jennifer immediately tries calling Cullen back repeatedly, but he's not picking up, and so she's left feeling totally confused about what her husband has just told her. But what stood out to her was how scared he sounded on the phone. And fear was not something she typically associated with Cullen. This beast of a man, this tough football player, he didn't get scared. So for him to be that scared sounding and to be describing people basically stalking him, she knew he was in serious trouble. So she calls 911 and she describes where he is in the Baldwin River, and the police take her report and say, "We'll send someone out right away." After Jennifer got off the phone with police, she called her family and told them about this really strange phone call from Cullen and how she had just called the police and she didn't know what to do. And so her brother tried calling Cullen and Cullen answered. And when he did, Matt said, "Hey, Cullen, where are you?" And Cullen would say, "I don't know where I am, but there's these 2 guys that are still following me." And Matt would say, "Are you still on your boat? Are you on land?" And all Cullen said is, "It's getting pretty rough out here." And then he hung up. Afterwards, Matt would call Jen and he would tell her about this phone call with Cullen, and it really didn't add any clarity to the situation. And so Jen and her family decide the best thing they can do is go to the boat ramp where Cullen had said he wanted to be picked up in hopes that maybe he would make his way there and they would find him. So Jennifer and her family head out to this location and Cullen's not there. They get out, they're yelling for him. There's no sign of him, and shortly after, a police car would show up because this was one of the areas where Jennifer had said when she spoke to police that Cullen might be. And so the police officer gets out, they take an official statement from Jennifer, and at this point they file an official missing person report. Before the police began looking for Cullen, they reached out to his wireless service provider and they asked them to ping his cell phone from the tower. Any service provider has the ability to roughly triangulate the location of a cell phone based on the last few locations of the phone. The last 4 locations that the service provider pinged for Cullen were up to 4 miles apart from each other, which was bizarre in its own way, because the idea that in a very rugged, rough area in a very short amount of time that Cullen had been moving 4, 5, 6, 7 miles just to get to these different points, that didn't really make sense. But also when they looked at these points on a map, it looked like each of them was either near a paved road, or in order to get to them, you would have had to cross a paved road. And so they're thinking to themselves, why does he keep moving point to point if at any one of these locations he's near relative safety? But as strange as these 4 locations were, the police now had a really solid starting point. So they dispatched people to each of these points and they began combing along the river where he had last been seen. And within an hour, they discovered his boat. It was a little ways down from where he had been dropped off. It was missing an oar and it was basically beached on the side of the river. It wasn't clear if it had been intentionally beached, but Cullen wasn't in it. And when they searched around the area, they couldn't find any sign that Cullen was in the area. They were yelling for him. He wasn't yelling back. Interestingly, a man who owned property near where the pontoon boat was found reported to police hearing screaming or yelling coming from the area where the boat was found around the same time that Cullen went missing. But despite this piece of information, it didn't actually help them discover where Cullen actually went. For the next 48 hours, police and hundreds of people searched in the areas where his cell phone had pinged and along the river where his pontoon had been found, but there was no sign of him. Then, on the evening of May 28th, approximately 48 hours after Cullen had gone missing, they discovered his body. It was located less than a half mile away from a paved road, and it was situated in between those 4 points that the cell phone provider had given. He was laying completely face down with his his right arm under his body and his left arm over his head, clutching some grass. When they rolled him over, he had some blood coming out of his nose, but besides that, there was no significant trauma anywhere on his body. Cullen appeared to be wearing all of his clothes. However, it was noted that the strap on his waders was really badly twisted. Now, if he had never taken his clothes off, that would have been something he would have fixed. It would have been very uncomfortable when he started this trip to go fishing. That would have been something he would have fixed. Now, he said to his wife on the phone that he was going to be taking his clothes off, which there was no explanation for that, but he clearly said that to his wife, and she reported that to police. And so some have speculated that between that phone call and finding him with the twisted strap on his waders, that indicates that perhaps his clothes did come off at some point over the past couple of days and were put back on again, either by him or by someone else. His cell phone had also been found in his front pocket, indicating that those cell phone pings had been his actual location. Initially, Cullen's autopsy was completely inconclusive. There was no trauma to his body. There was no obvious thing that killed him. But later on, it was determined he died of pneumonia caused by inhaling his own vomit. So we don't know how you get to a place where you're inhaling your own vomit, but I would imagine you're in a pretty panicked state of mind if that could happen to you. Many people believe Cullen's death was the result of a traumatic brain injury caused by all the years of playing football and getting hit in the head. And so that can lead to paranoia. And so perhaps this was a fit of paranoia. He got turned around. He got scared. He thought somebody was chasing him. And then, he vomits and inhales his vomit, and that ultimately kills him. And in 2011, Cullen had briefly shown signs of being a little bit paranoid when one day he thought someone was following him, and he actually went to a family member's house and said, "I think someone's following me," but he could never identify where this person was or who they were. But even if this was a fit of paranoia and no one was following him in the woods, well, why didn't he stop on the paved road every time he crossed it? Because that would have represented safety. I mean, in 2011, when he supposedly had another fit of paranoia, his instincts were to go to a family member and to seek help. And so you would think his instincts in this situation would be similar. He would seek help. He would seek safety. But he continuously left safety. He left the road. He left his boat. His boat was safety. Why did he leave his boat? And even if we turn this around and we say, no, it was not a fit of paranoia, that he was in fact being followed by someone or something in the woods, well then why would that prompt him to call his wife and say, I'm going to get out of the boat and take my clothes off, and then proceed to walk 4, 5, 6, 7 miles in a very short period of time, crossing over a paved road at least 1 or 2 times and not stopping, not signaling for help? That doesn't make sense either. And what was that screaming that resident heard coming from the area where the pontoon boat was found? Unfortunately, there are many questions in this case, and the vast majority of them. September 15th, 2010, a 55-year-old man named Greg Flanagan checked into the Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas to start his work week. As a young man, Greg had worked as a chief engineer on ocean-going vessels, spending months out at sea. But in his middle age, he had reinvented himself as a landman. It was Greg's job to secure leases of mineral rights and land for drilling. Greg was slender and fit-looking despite the fact that he never exercised and he smoked constantly. He kept a close-cropped white beard, and he had the leathered skin of a lifelong outdoorsman. Every Monday morning, Greg would make the 2-hour commute in his pickup truck from Lafayette, Louisiana, all the way to Beaumont, Texas, where his company would always rent him a room. The hotel itself was neither good nor bad, but to Greg, he didn't care. He just needed a bed and a TV. Once Greg walked inside, he had a bathroom immediately to his right, and then a little bit farther in was the main section of the hotel room, which was very basic. Straight ahead, there was a window that looked down onto a small pool that was lined with potted plants. And then in the main space was a queen-size bed tucked up against the right wall, and then on the left wall was a TV. Greg wheeled his one suitcase into the hotel room, and he put it at the foot of the bed, and he opened it up. He pulled out the shirts that he wanted to keep wrinkle-free for the week, and he hung them in his closet. Then he pulled out his toiletries that were kept in a cloth bag with a hook, and he hooked those onto a towel rack. Then he took off his very worn brown boots and his faded blue jeans, and he slipped on some pajama pants. Anytime Greg stayed at the Elegante, he rarely left his room. There was a bar downstairs, but he wasn't a big drinker or socializer. He preferred to just have quiet nights alone in his room watching TV. So that night, Greg cranked the air conditioning to make sure it was as cold as it could get. He liked to sleep in a very cold room. And then he hopped on his bed and he put 2 big pillows behind his head and he rested up against the headboard. And then he took a towel and he laid it out next to him. And on the towel was his ashtray, his cigarettes, his lighter, his phone, the TV remote, and and a candy bar. Then he picked up the TV remote, turned it on, flicked through the channels until he landed on one that was playing Iron Man 2, and he thought, good enough, put the remote down, picked up his candy bar, opened it up, he ate a piece of his candy, and then he grabbed a cigarette, lit up a cigarette, and he began smoking. The following morning, Susie, Greg's wife, did not get a call from her husband, and he always called her every morning that he was gone. That was their routine, and this was a big break from their routine. And so she tried calling him, and his phone rang and rang and rang, and he never picked up. And so then she called his Beaumont office, and he didn't pick up. But after the second or third time she called, his coworkers picked up the phone, and they said, hey, Greg's not here. He hasn't come into work yet. And Susie felt concerned. She felt like something was wrong. And she said, do you guys mind just going to his hotel room and knocking on his door and making sure he's okay? And they said, sure, we'll go over there. So the two coworkers head over to the hotel. They knock on Greg's door. He doesn't answer. And so they go down and get the manager, who comes up and opens Greg's door. And right away, they find Greg lying dead in the middle of his hotel room. The way Greg was positioned when they found him, it looked like he had fallen to his knees and then fallen again onto his face. And his left arm got kind of tucked underneath his body, and still in his two left fingers was a cigarette that had not fallen from his hand, that had burned down to the wick. The room was exceptionally warm, and Greg's skin was grayish blue. Immediately after seeing Greg, the two coworkers called 911. Shortly after the ambulance arrived at the hotel, Detective Scott Apple arrived in his cruiser. Apple was a short guy, very, very fit. He had silver hair that he spiked up. He looked 100% cop, and he worked basically 24/7. When he got up to room 348, there was no sign of a break-in, nothing had been disturbed inside of the room, and there was no blood or obvious wound on Greg, with the exception of a slight abrasion on his cheek when he came down and hit his face on the rug. He looked around the room and he found Greg's wallet that was sitting in the back pocket of his jeans, and there was hundreds of dollars in his wallet that had not been taken, so he ruled out robbery. He went out into the hall and he began interviewing the other occupants of the surrounding rooms, and no one had heard anything and no one had seen anything. He went back into the hotel room and he began looking around for drugs of any kind or any substance that Greg might have taken that could have contributed to his death, and there was nothing. No prescription pills, no alcohol, nothing. Later that day, after the family had been notified of Greg's passing, his grief-stricken wife, Susie, called Detective Apple, and she said, my husband did not take good care of himself. He had a terrible diet. He's been smoking like a chimney since he was a young teenager, and he never saw a doctor. And I always told him that if he wasn't careful, something like this was going to happen. I always worried that he might have a heart attack or something. So at this point, not only does Greg's family think he died of natural causes, Detective Apple also thinks the same thing. He's thinking about what he saw in the hotel room, and there's no sign of any foul play. It just looks like a guy whose lifestyle caught up to him. Greg's body was sent to Dr. Tommy Brown, who in Beaumont, Texas, he was like the medical examiner. He'd been doing this for years and years. Dr. Brown had read ahead that they believed Greg had died of a heart attack or something like that. And when his body was wheeled in front of him, there was nothing he saw right away that contradicted that theory. The only two marks that the doctor noted on the outside of Greg's body was the small abrasion on his face from where he landed on the rug, and then he also had another small abrasion on his crotch. But beyond that, the rest of his body was completely unblemished. When he looked inside of his body, it looked like someone had literally just crushed his insides. His torso was full of blood. Food from his intestines had been ripped outside. He had ribs broken, internal organs were lacerated, and there was a hole in his heart. Dr. Brown was really confused at what he was looking at, because the severity of Greg's internal injuries were more consistent with someone who had been in a severe car crash or who had had a really heavy object land on them. But Greg didn't have any significant external injuries that would support either of those two things happening to him. And he was found in the middle of a hotel room where there was nothing disturbed and no one had apparently seen or heard anything. And so Dr. Brown says, look, I don't have all the answers here, but this was not natural. This is a homicide. And my best guess is he was beaten to death. I know it doesn't really make sense because there's not any external injuries, but he suffered some significant trauma from somebody else, and that's what killed him. When Detective Apple got this report from the medical examiner, he was just as confused as Dr. Brown was, but his attention turned to, okay, well, if he's been murdered, who would want to murder him? And he began digging into Greg's background, and he found that he was universally liked. He was known for being incredibly courteous and polite. He kept to himself. He was in love with his wife, and his wife loved him back. There was no evidence of some scandal in the background. He was just this really nice, normal guy, and it didn't make any sense why anybody would want to kill him. After a few months of getting nowhere, and in reality, he hadn't really even gotten started because there wasn't any good starting point. The only thing he could find that was odd about the crime scene was that the room was particularly warm when they walked inside, which was not in keeping with how Greg would have kept the room. But that doesn't explain why his insides were crushed. And so he's gotten nowhere, and then he makes a discovery. He found in the hotel's maintenance logs on the night Greg died, he had been making popcorn in his microwave and managed to blow a fuse. And it wasn't just his power. Maybe Greg didn't know this, but he cut the power to both the room next to him on his right and on his left and below him. And so he calls down to the front desk, and a maintenance guy came up and he reset the breaker. This opened the door to two theories. The first theory is the maintenance guy, who did have a criminal record, when he came up to fix the breaker, he attacked Greg. But that was wildly speculative, and there was no evidence to suggest that the maintenance guy would do that, and so that was quickly ruled out. The other theory was Greg's neighbors in room 349 were these two electricians who were big partiers and drinkers, and so Detective Apple suggested that maybe when Greg accidentally cut the power to their room, they were really annoyed, and they went outside in the hall, and they saw Greg, and they somehow realized he was to blame for this, and in a drunken rage, they attacked him and killed him, and that's what killed Greg. And even though it was a stretch, it was the closest thing to a motive Detective Apple had found in anyone. And so Detective Apple put on a hidden camera, and he went and interviewed these two electricians that were still staying in room 349. And he said when he spoke to them, they were very forthcoming. They seemed very honest. They were appropriately curious about what happened to Greg. And all they said was, look, we had no interaction with him. We did hear him coughing when we came back from the bar. We were at the bar that night, but honestly, that's the extent of our interaction with him. The electricians offered up their cell phone numbers, their email addresses, and said, anything you need from us, we'd be happy to help. We're really sorry this happened. At this point, Detective Apple is back to square one. No one knows what happened to this guy. The one big lead he had, the maintenance records, proved to be a total dead end. And so unfortunately, this case went cold. 7 months after Greg's death, where there had been absolutely no traction on figuring out what happened to him, Susie, Greg's wife, decided she wanted to hire a private investigator. And her friend suggested she call Ken Brennan, who was a famous private detective who was well known for being able to solve really complex cases. And so on a whim, Susie calls Ken Brennan, not expecting to get through to him, thinking he's probably super busy and has other cases because he's on TV and he's this really famous guy. But he picked up the phone and he was like, hey, how can I help you? And Susie couldn't believe it. She had a chance to tell him about what happened to her husband, and Ken said he was really interested and that he would take on the case. Ken was a former Long Island cop, and he was a DEA special agent. He spoke with a really thick New York City accent, and he wore t-shirts that were a little bit too small to show off his muscles, and he usually had a big, gaudy gold chain on. Once Ken agreed to take on this case, he flew right to Lafayette, Louisiana, where Susie lived, and he sat down and he asked her a lot of really difficult questions about their marriage, about whether she thought he might be cheating on her, if he had like a secret life she didn't know about. And after feeling satisfied that all those avenues had been explored and were not going to lead to the answer, he said, okay, well, can you tell me anything about the crime scene that stood out to you? Is there anything about it that seems off? And Susie said, yeah, Greg always kept the air conditioning on very cold at night. He never slept in a room that wasn't freezing cold. And so I thought it was really odd when his coworkers discovered him that the air conditioning was off and it was really hot inside of the room. That's incredibly unlike Greg for his air conditioning to be off. Ken made a note of this, and then he left Lafayette and he went to Beaumont, Texas to meet up with Detective Apple. And Detective Apple and he actually got along really well. They agreed to work together on this case because Detective Apple feels like he's reached a dead end anyways. Apple brought Ken to the crime scene. He showed him the hotel room, and then afterwards he turned over all of the documents he had on the case, from the autopsy report to the photographs to anything he'd collected over the 7 months he'd been working on it. So that night, Ken diligently looks through all of the documentation, all of the photos, and the next day when he goes into Apple's office, he says to him, I think I figured it out. And Apple's like, oh, really? You figured it out one day after being here? And Ken's like, no, seriously, I think I figured it out. I have to confirm something with his wife, but I think I have a theory. And so Ken calls Susie right in front of Apple. And when Susie picks up, Ken's like, hey, did your husband ever smoke with his left hand or did he smoke with his right hand? And Susie said, oh no, he only smoked with his right hand. Then Ken goes, thank you very much. He hangs up and he goes, Apple, I got it. And so Apple's like, okay, what's your theory? And Ken says, okay. So I spoke to Susie and she told me it was very strange that his room was not air conditioned when they discovered his body, because Greg was known for always turning on the air conditioning to as cold as it can get, especially at night when he went to bed. And so when his power went out the night before, his air conditioning would have gone out. And so the maintenance guy comes up, turns the power back on, but it doesn't trigger the air conditioning to turn back on. The room is still cold from having been air conditioned all evening to that point. And so the TV is back on, and so perhaps Greg turns and just starts watching TV. Because the room feels air conditioned, he hasn't realized that he hasn't turned the air conditioning back on again. Now, this is Beaumont in the summer, so it's going to get really hot in his room really quickly. And as soon as it starts to warm up in there, he's going to realize, oh, I didn't turn the AC back on, and he would go over and turn it on again. And so because the air conditioning wasn't on, and we know that the power was restored at 8:30, then he must have died after the power was on, but before it got warm enough in the room for him to recognize he did not turn the AC on, which means he would have died somewhere between 8:30 and 9 p.m. at night. And so Apple's like, wow, that's pretty impressive, except that doesn't really help us figure out how he died or who killed him. And Ken puts his hand up and he says, I know, I'm just building the whole picture here. Okay, so we have him dying between 8:30 and 9, and I don't think he was beaten to death. I think a lot of people want that to be what killed him because it's kind of the only thing that might make sense, but I say it definitely doesn't make sense because of the cigarette. Now, we found that cigarette in his left hand, and I talked to his wife, and she said he only smokes in his right hand. And so what I think happened is the power came back on at about 8:30, which is what the report says. The TV turns back on. Greg doesn't turn the air conditioning back on. He sits on his bed. He's watching TV. He lights up a cigarette, and he's smoking with his right hand. And then something happens to him, which I'll get into my theories on that. And he jumps off the bed, and he starts making his way to the door to get help. And he transfers the cigarette from his right hand to his left hand so he can use his right hand to turn the doorknob and open the door to safety. But he doesn't make it. He falls to his knees and he falls to the ground and his cigarette's still in his fingers and he dies. And Apple's like, you know what? That's pretty good. It makes a lot of sense. But the crucial missing piece here is, well, what was the trauma he suffered that caused him to jump from his bed and run to the door and then ultimately die? Ken's like, I got a theory on that too, but I got to be in the hotel room to see if it's true. So Apple and Ken go back to the hotel room. When they get there, Ken goes inside and he starts walking around, looking at the ceiling, the wall, the ground. And then finally he stops when he's looking back towards the front door leading back into the hall. And he points at the wall and he says, there. And Apple looks at what he's pointing at, and it looks like there had been some patchwork on the wall in the same spot where the doorknob, when it swings open, would hit the wall. And so Apple's looking at it and he's like, that's just from the doorknob. And so Ken takes the door and he opens it all the way to where the doorknob is pressed against the wall, and it's to the right of this patchwork, meaning this patchwork is not connected to the doorknob. Apple was confused and was about to ask questions, and Ken was like on a roll, and he said, hold on, and he goes outside, he goes next door to room 349, they go inside, and Apple walks in the room, and he's watching Ken do his work, and Ken's rubbing his hands all over the wall, and eventually he stops, and he looks up at Apple, and he takes his finger, and he pushes on one spot in the wall as Apple is watching, and his finger goes right in. And what he pushed on was this little chunk of toothpaste that had been wedged in this little tiny hole in the wall, and he pushed it through. Apple brought in a crime scene investigations unit who carefully excavated both sides of this wall, and they shined a laser from 349 into Greg's room, and the trajectory of the laser going through this hole lined up perfectly with where Greg would have been sitting on the bed, smoking cigarettes, eating candy, watching a movie. So Ken and Apple go back to the medical examiner, Dr. Brown, and they say, look, you missed something because Greg got shot. And unfortunately, Greg's body had already been cremated, but they did have the pictures to look at from the autopsy. And sure enough, they find that little tiny laceration in his crotch was actually an entrance wound. And then when Dr. Brown pointed out there was a hole in the heart, and it kind of lined up with the trajectory that bullet would have been traveling through his body, Dr. Brown realized he had made a mistake, and he changed the autopsy report to reflect a gunshot wound. Ken and Detective Apple re-interviewed one of the electricians that had been in room 349 that was in the room where the gunshot had originated from. His name was Lance. And when they brought him in, they said, this is totally routine. You know, it's been 7+ months since Greg's death. And what we're doing is any of our witnesses, we want them to sign a statement, basically attesting that this is what I saw or didn't see. And so they had prepared a statement that basically lined up with the first thing he had told police, which was, I didn't hear anything, I didn't see anything. And they said, is there anything you want to change about your story? Or is this exactly what you saw and heard? And Lance said, yeah, that's exactly, I don't know anything. I wish I knew more. I'm sorry. And like, all right, well then can you sign this document saying that you don't know anything and you didn't see anything? And he said, yeah. He signs the document, and then Ken's like, all right, gotcha, because we know a gunshot was fired from your room and that's what killed Greg. And so you need to tell me who shot the gun. Otherwise, I'm taking you to jail for submitting a false police report. At this point, Lance crumbles and the truth comes out. And he said that he and the other electrician in the room with him, whose name was Mueller, they were goofing around and drinking that night. And Mueller went out and got his pistol from his car and he brought it in and he was goofing around with it. And Lance was saying that he was trying to get him to stop doing that, but he kept goofing around with the gun. And at one point, he aimed the gun at Lance, and Lance kind of batted it away from him. He dropped the gun, it landed, and it went off. And they saw where the bullet hole was. They saw it was into Greg's room, and they both froze and they listened to see if anybody had reacted to this gunshot. And he said they didn't hear anything for a long time, and that made them believe that no one was in the other room, that no one was in Greg's room, and that they were in the clear. And so they left and went to the bar. They didn't even think to check on whoever was in that room. And when they came back, they said they heard Greg coughing in his room, and that further confirmed that he must not have been in there when they fired the shot, and he's totally fine and they are totally in the clear. The next day, Lance said when they saw his body being taken out, at first they did think, oh my goodness, this is us. We did this. But they overheard Detective Apple walking around interviewing people saying out loud that, yeah, we think this is natural causes. Yep, looks like a heart attack. This is probably nothing. I'm sure it's nothing. And they were like, oh, phew, it's not us. And so they actually believed it was just a coincidence that on the same day they're firing a rogue bullet into Greg's room, that Greg had a heart attack and died separately. But Lance would say that somewhere in the back of both of their minds, they knew they probably had something to do with it. And so they covered their tracks and they put toothpaste in the wall to cover up the hole, and they hid the gun, and they intentionally kept information from the police. And so ultimately Mueller, the owner of the gun, the one who really instigated that night, waving the gun around, and the one who actually dropped the gun, he was charged with manslaughter and was given 10 years in prison. On June 7th, 1951, two families from Santa Fe, New Mexico met up at the Santa Fe ski basin to have a picnic together and to enjoy the mountain air. During the summer months when there's no snow on the ground, the Santa Fe ski basin is a very popular location for hikers because the terrain is very rugged, and if you get up to the top of the basin, there's these incredible views overlooking the valley. But on this day, the two families decided they wanted to have a picnic at the base of the basin, basically looking up the mountain. As the parents were setting up the picnic site, the kids started playing together, and that was Larry and Janet McGee, who were brother and sister aged 7 and 5 respectively, and Stephen Cross, who was 3 years old. After they finished setting up their picnic site, they look around and realize the kids are gone, and they're thinking, we just saw them like 2 minutes ago, so they can't have gone very far. And so they start looking around for their kids, and they can't find them. They're yelling out for them, and they're starting to get a little bit more worried, and they start branching out farther and farther, and they realize the only other place they could have gone is up into the woods, which are very steep and very rugged. So they're thinking, well, they can't have gone into the mountains. That would be impossible for these young kids to get very far, and they aren't responding to our calls. It's possible they could have been abducted. And so one of the parents ran down to the main building of the actual ski resort where they kept a staff member in there during the summer months, and they were able to get inside and use a phone, and they called authorities. So the police come out and they set up these huge spotlights that are aimed up at the mountain. And so the idea was, if the kids did get up into the mountain somehow, they would see these lights and hopefully walk down to them. After they set up the spotlights, the police began combing the side of the mountain in hopes that the kids were not abducted. But despite the spotlights and hundreds of searchers and people yelling out for these kids, they never heard back from the kids. They didn't find them. And so all night they're looking for them, and they're realizing that there's a pretty good chance they're probably not here. And that means they probably were abducted. And so by the following afternoon, things were really starting to look grim. There was no sign of these kids anywhere. And that's when a searcher who was way outside of the primary search area, they were about 3.5 miles away, thousands of feet up in elevation. They're up there and they're looking around and they're getting ready to leave when they see something out of the corner of their eye that looks like a person. They turn around and one of the kids is poking their head up from behind a log. And the searchers run over to them, and sure enough, the 3 kids were actually inside of this downed log, and they were all okay. As the searchers are picking them up and calling this in, they're thinking to themselves, how in the world did these kids get so far away? Once the children were brought back down to the search headquarters and were reunited with their parents and were checked out by a doctor who said, yep, they're a little dehydrated, but they're okay. After all that was done, the police asked them the question that everybody was thinking: how did you get where you were found? And Larry, the oldest of the group, he was 7 years old. It took him a minute, but eventually he said, they were playing around the picnic area and they went just barely into the tree line when all of a sudden a bear came out from behind a tree and began chasing them. And the 3 of them ran 3.5 miles up a mountain to find this log, which they jumped inside of, and they hid inside of this log from this bear, which apparently was patrolling the area looking for them. And in addition to this bear that was apparently walking around the area looking for them, Larry said they were especially scared of the gorilla that was walking around the area looking for them as well. Now, it's easy to discount Larry and the kid's story because you could say, okay, well, the gorilla they saw was actually just a searcher looking for them. Except there was no one in that area looking for the kids near that log until right before they were found. It was kind of like a last-ditch effort to push outside the boundaries of the main search area. It was just kind of a miracle they actually located them. And Larry and the kids were saying this gorilla and this bear were looking for them on the first day and first night they were out there. So there were no searchers out there at that time. As for the bear, there have been bear sightings in the Santa Fe ski basin, although it is fairly rare. But if it was a bear that was chasing these kids, it would have caught them. A bear is not gonna not be able to catch 3 small children running uphill. So either there wasn't a bear, or it was some other animal that might have resembled a bear. But what type of an animal would chase 3 small children who are very vulnerable 3.5 miles up a mountain only to abandon them? But even if we say, you know what, there's no way the bear and the gorilla had anything to do with this. This is just kids who got lost and they wound up in the woods and they were found, and that's it. Fine. But I have a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I can tell you right now, there's no way they could cover a 3.5 mile distance uphill in really rugged mountainous terrain in a 24-hour cycle. There's no way. Without help, that's not possible. I would say the only caveat to that would be if my children were fearful for their lives, in which case adrenaline would kick in, and they probably could cover that distance in a 24-hour period. That certainly lends credibility to the idea that Larry, Janet, and Steve were in fact running for their lives, and they had that adrenaline kick, and that's how they were able to cover that distance. But were they really running from a bear or a gorilla? We don't know, and there's been no further investigation into this case, and I think that's because the kids were found alive. The parents, the police,